Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jane Harman, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center and a recovering politician. Many of you know that tomorrow, June 5th, is the one-year anniversary of the beginning of the Snowden leaks, and this panel is timed for that. There will be a follow-on panel in London next week at Chatham House, which is a marvelously impressive think tank in London, and we are going to co-sponsor the events there. Nothing could have happened today without the enormous, brilliant input of Meg King, who is my chief of staff and who worked with me on Capitol Hill and who also worked at DOD and who knows a lot more about this subject than maybe even some of the people on this panel, certainly including me. And I want to thank her for putting together an extraordinary day. I also see Wolfgang Ischinger in the front row. What you need to know about him is he is a scholar at the Wilson Center. He also was, by the way, the German ambassador to the United States and then the German ambassador to the United Kingdom and a deputy foreign minister of Germany. And most recently, he was in Ukraine chairing the very interesting roundtables that the OSCE established to try to get buy-in in the country before the election. But you'll hear from Wolfgang later. Let me just say a few things about this subject, which was a central focus of mine in Congress and remains a central focus of mine. I think the only thing that Edward Snowden and I have in common, if we even have this in common, is that on September 11th, 2001, we each felt it was a cataclysmic event. I won't speak for him, but in my case, I was walking toward the United States Capitol to go to a meeting in the Intelligence Committee, which was then in the dome of the Capitol, which most people thought was the intended target of the fourth airplane that went down in Pennsylvania. And of course, everything changed. The Capitol closed, the House and Senate office buildings closed. They reopened later, but I think our world changed. And I had a fairly substantial part in the play that unfolded after 9/11, especially focused on what laws would be enacted around surveillance. And we'll share some of that conversation in a minute. But I'm still intensely involved and think, by and large, our country has done really quite well with this. And think, I will share this later too, that Edward Snowden's contribution has been, by and large, unhelpful. At any rate, we now have our first panel, which will look at the broad issues, followed by other panels that will look at more specific issues. Of course, David Sanger is our moderator. What you need to know about David Sanger is he wrote his first book on the Obama administration entitled The Inheritance at the Wilson Center. Applause. He then inexplicably wrote a second book on the Obama administration, not at the Wilson Center, so we won't talk about that one. But he is the Washington correspondent, chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times. He has had a stellar history. He was part of Pulitzer Prize teams. He knows everything about everything. He is certainly steeped in this subject. He also is a member of the Aspen Strategy Group, as am I, and uses that as his excuse to go fishing in Aspen every August. But it is now my pleasure to introduce David, who will introduce our stellar panel. Welcome to the Wilson Center.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thanks, Jane, for the introduction and for having an alumni back at Wilson. I have to say that the time I spent writing here was a lot more pleasant than what my daily life is like reporting around Washington. So we have a great panel today, and the objective is to sort of set up the day for you by covering three broad areas. One is whether or not the kind of reforms that are underway now will make a difference in any way in how the intelligence community operates, and whether or not there were other ways to get to this point. We want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the government and high technology industry since the revelations of the past year, and a bit about the relationship between the U.S. and its allies. And I think the objective here in this week of anniversaries, because we have D-Day, Tiananmen Square, and the Snowden stuff, is not really to dwell on Mr. Snowden himself. There's been a lot said and done about that, but basically to try to look forward about what is lasting here and what is not. We have on the panel Mike Leiter, to Jane's left there. He's the National Security and Counterterrorism Analyst for NBC. He also works for Palantir here. He had been the director of the National Counterterrorism Center until July of 2011. He is expert in all of these subjects. We're also very lucky to have Bob Litt here. He is the General Counsel of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He was also a partner at Arnold & Porter and has worked for DOJ, dealt a lot with FISA applications at that time, covert action reviews, and so forth. So he is in a perfect place to be able to talk to us about what's changed here and what is not. And Jane, you of course know from her time as, what do you call yourself, a recovering politician?
Yeah.
She hasn't fully recovered, as we all know, if you know Jane, but she's on her way of being detoxed at this point. So let me start with the first question. So let's assume for a minute that a year ago this week, the Snowden revelations hadn't happened. You could rewrite history. Bob, apart from the fact that it would have made your last year a lot more pleasant, okay, tell us whether or not you think there was a pathway by which the kind of reforms that the president has now embraced after signing off on these programs for 5 years running prior to the disclosures could have been reformed, and whether it's possible to entertain the thought that even if you abhor everything that Snowden did, and I think all three of you at various points have described that in various versions, that perhaps there was some lasting bit of needed reform, perhaps good, that came out of the experience.
I think one of the principal lessons that people in the intelligence community on up to the president have taken from the events of the last year is that we do need to find a way to talk more about what it is that we do. I think that obviously when you're operating an intelligence enterprise, there's a whole lot that's going to have to remain secret, because if you have an entirely transparent intelligence enterprise, you don't have an intelligence enterprise. But I think that we could and should have found a way to explain more the legal authorities that we operate under, the protections that exist for privacy and civil liberties, the oversight activities. And it happens to be my view that if we had done that, there probably wouldn't be a need for a lot of the reform activities that have taken place. I think that had we been able to explain things and been able to, in the sense, that it was physically impossible for us, but there just was not that sort of mindset within the intelligence community. Had we been able to go out and articulate, here's what we're doing, and here's how you're protected on it, I think we would have been in a very different situation than we are now, and I'm not sure that any of these reforms would have been necessary. I do think that in a sort of forward-looking mode, I think that one of the issues that is going to have to be addressed is how congressional oversight of the intelligence community works. Because the fact of the matter is that in the wake of the Church and Pike committees, there was a sort of political compromise set up that says, how do we balance political oversight and the need for secrecy? And the way that was done was through the congressional oversight committees. We have a statutory obligation to keep them fully and currently informed of intelligence activities. And although Jane will comment on this, I'm sure, by and large we do. And in fact, the the various activities that have been leaked to the press were all fully known to the intelligence committees and also to the judiciary committees under the FISA statute. That oversight process is now under tremendous stress, both within the Congress, from members of Congress who felt, why didn't we know about this? And from the public whose attitude is, why didn't we know about this? And there seems to be less acceptance of the concept of the intelligence committees as proxies for the public. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the next year or two in terms of how oversight takes place and what mechanisms there are for providing assurance to the public that, in fact, there is adequate oversight.
Jane, listening to Bob's answer, he's made the case, and I think almost all the committee's members that I've spoken to agree, certainly the committees were fully informed. But when you are doing something like bulk surveillance, where suddenly for the first time you are, I should say bulk collection, not bulk surveillance.
Right.
When you are...
I had a little mental note on that point.
Yeah, when you are gathering the phone numbers that are dialed out, even if it's just business records, even if it's just basically billing records of all Americans. At that point, is oversight sufficient, or do you need some democratic buy-in? Because the reaction that we've seen here has come, by and large, from those people who obviously are not part of oversight committees, either on the Hill or the general public. And I think you could argue that had the bulk collection program been openly up for a vote in the years immediately after 9/11, it probably would have passed overwhelmingly. And I'm not sure if I was an aspiring terrorist that it would have necessarily changed my activity all that much. Because if you go to the movies, you think the United States government does all of this and much more.
Well, several part answer. Let's go back to 9/11. After 9/11, certainly my primary focus, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody here and lots of you in the audience and listening in, was to keep our country safe. That didn't mean I wanted to shred our Constitution, but many of us felt there would be another big attack, and we had to do what we could. I was then, or shortly after 9/11, I became the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. That put me in the so-called Gang of Eight. That's the group of people briefed on our most secret programs, along with the leader, the minority leader in both houses. Then it's the chairman and the ranking member of both intelligence committees. That's how I got there. So I went down to the White House on a regular basis and was usually in the Situation Room and was briefed by Mike Hayden and Dick Cheney on a new program, which became this phone metadata program. And I was assured, I'm not going to reveal anything in those briefings, although it's pretty stale now, but nonetheless, that was the rule. Couldn't talk to anybody. I was assured every other sentence that the program fully complied with law. Of course, I thought, Harvard Law School educated person, that the law was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which, as Bob just mentioned, was passed by overwhelming bipartisan margins in the 1970s during the Carter administration. I was then in the Carter White House, to correct the abuses or the alleged abuses found by the Church Committee of the Nixon administration. FISA had worked very well. I thought this new program fully complied with FISA, federal law. Well, oops, didn't. 4 years later, once it leaked to the New York Times, not for me, President Bush, 43, declassified the program, and I was able to check on the legal basis. And then a former general counsel of the CIA, whom I called, said, hey, dummy, don't you understand this couldn't possibly comply with FISA? This obviously was justified under the president's emergency commander-in-chief authorities. And why is that story relevant? We then subsequently learned about the hospital room, the late visit to John Ashcroft, who had refused to extend the program, and so on and so forth. But it's relevant because Congress was basically bypassed, and there was no public debate on the contours of this program for 4 years. Once it became clear what it was, the public debate started. Edward Snowden, I'm not sure what job he held then, and I'm not sure why I'm even talking about Edward Snowden, had no role in the effort that was made by many people in Congress to make certain that the program, once discovered, fully complied with FISA. It took a while. Congress is a kind of partisan, dysfunctional place. I thought I'd point that out. And it took a while, and it wasn't until 2008 that FISA was debated and reformed to cover the contours of this program. There was a public debate, and the sections of FISA that we're talking about, which are codified, or the program, which is codified under the Patriot Act, under the, I don't know which act it is.
Well, they're actually two separate.
All right. Well, Bob will explain. One is yes. I'm confusing it, but there are two different programs. I'm sure we'll get to the other one. But whichever program, wherever this thing is, sunsets every 3 years. So Congress has had to vote on it again, and Senator Obama had to vote on it, and he voted on it. And so this has been in the public realm. Was it sufficiently? Was everyone clued in? No, but certainly Congress was, and not just the committees. And I just want to say one thing more, because Bob mentioned, that there isn't the same kind of respect and deference for the intelligence committees anymore in Congress. That's true, but there isn't any respect and deference for anything in Congress. So I'm not sure that that's what the problem is. I think the sort of broken business model of Congress is the problem.
Jane, can I just return you to the question of democratic buy-in here? That there was something different about these programs because you were doing bulk collection on all Americans. And therefore, you needed democratic buy-in or run the risk of a reaction when it leaked because, let's face it, all these things become public sooner or later.
Well, the program wasn't designed, I mean, it doesn't say in the law, you intelligence agencies, you NSA shall do bulk collection. It describes a basic program, and then it has the safeguards. The safeguards are congressional oversight, which I would claim does work and still works, and FISA court review of the contours of the program. We had basket review. These are some things that are being changed, but nonetheless, they were debated. I didn't know, I personally didn't know, maybe some of you knew, that this automatically would mean that millions of records were collected. It meant that an agency with great technical ability would decide how much is collected, but the safeguards would apply against the collection. And just to remind, I don't know of one instance where this collected metadata has been abused. Not one. So let's keep that in mind. But the scope of it was left up to NSA, the scope of the collection.
Mike, from where you sat at the Counterterrorism Center, let's try an alternative reality. Let's say that
it's much better than the current one.
Right. Let's say that the bulk collection program, and then we'll move on to other and let's say higher tech programs later on, but had been made public from the beginning, that it had passed Congress. The president had gone out and given a speech that said, my fellow Americans, in the era we're living, post 9/11, I recognize that many people are uncomfortable with the idea of the government having a look at these billing records, but it's just billing records. It enables us to move in speedily. We might have been able to find the 9/11, one of the 9/11 conspirators early on, had we had this in summer of 2001. And let's say it had passed. What difference would that have made in the way that terrorists operate? Do you think the program could have been public and still have been useful?
Well, I do want to come back to the foundation of the question.
Sure.
Because I think from the president's perspective, in many ways, that did happen through the debate about the reauthorization of the FISA Amendments Act and the Patriot Act. Now, I understand, I want to talk about what that means by the public discussion, because the definition of public discussion is a key one here. Do I think terrorists would have reacted? Yes. I think I swore I was going to mention Snowden's name, but I will. Edward Snowden's most recent claim that no harm was done, and if it was, show me the person who was harmed, is sort of laughable from my perspective. And without disclosing any secrets, it's very clear that terrorists read David Sanger, and they read the Washington Post, and they read lots of stuff. And they do, in fact, alter their modus operandi based on what they think the U.S. can do. So I'll give you what is now an unclassified example, certain terrorists who, Faisal Shahzad, who attacked Times Square with a fertilizer bomb, was extremely sophisticated in his communications back with TTP, a Pakistani terrorist group, and was in fact very, very careful to do things which he believed were not covered by NSA surveillance or very, very difficult for NSA to surveil. So terrorists absolutely do look. Now, do I think if the president had made that speech in 2008 or President Bush had made it in 2006 when the controversy first arose, would the country have been less safe? It would have been harder for the US government to collect certain information using certain tools. So the question becomes, can you collect it in other ways, using other tools? And that's actually a good question for the government to ask all the time. And that goes to the initial question of, could we have gotten here without Edward Snowden? And my answer is maybe, but it wouldn't have been easy. Because government gets in a rut. The executive branch gets in a rut, Congress gets in a rut. I don't actually mean this critical, I mean it critically of the Congress, not of the executive branch.
Yeah.
They're in a constructive rut sometimes. But when you're doing this work every day and you're collecting all this metadata, and you're working really hard and you're trying to collect other data for other types of communications, it's really hard to go back and say, all right, we've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, it's been authorized by Congress. Is there a way that we could get the exact data we need in ways that are more protective of privacy and civil liberties with the same operational outcome? That's hard to do. It takes extra time, it takes extra thinking, and you get in a rut. And I think what we saw out of Snowden is, frankly, the NCTC, NSA, to some extent the DNI, certainly the White House. You get in a rut thinking what you're doing is good and there isn't a better way to do the same thing. Now, Congress absolutely gets in a rut. And I thought Bob's phrase of the proxies that the Congressional Intelligence Committees are supposed to be was a great one. The problem is, I think, with all respectfully of the intelligence committees, they got in a rut in a sort of agency capture way. And I don't mean in an untold awful way, because they're still very hard on the executive branch and do serious oversight. But they stopped being, through almost no fault of their own, a perfect proxy for what some of the public and what the rest of the Congress thought about these things once they became public. Well, you can disagree with me, but the fact is that a lot of their constituencies weren't actually in line with what some of these members were thinking. Now, I think the members were actually right, but their constituencies didn't agree with them, and that's what we saw when Snowden leaked.
But isn't that inevitable, Jane, when, these committees are read into all of these programs, they, and the only people they're hearing in these classified briefings are members of the agency. They're not hearing some outside public advocate saying there's another way.
Well, actually, I don't agree with that. Yes, the classified briefings are from the government, and yes, Pete Huckstra, who used to be the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, a Republican from Michigan, used to talk about 20 questions. If you didn't ask exactly the right question to the briefer, you wouldn't get the answer. We also often had low-level briefers who didn't know about anything except the specific thing in that person's silo and couldn't give a bigger picture. But we improved that. Here are the ways in which we reached out. First of all, some members of the Intelligence Committee protested things we were briefed on and reached out. I happened to be one of them. I went out in 2002. I was briefed on the so-called enhanced interrogation programs. And I had some major concerns, and I wrote a classified letter to the then CIA General Counsel. My letter's been declassified since, asking what the policy guidance was for these techniques and urging them not to destroy any videotapes that were made. Of course, they were later destroyed. Shows how influential I was. But nonetheless, I pushed back. Mark Udall and Ron Wyden felt very strongly, and Jay Rockefeller, in disagreement with a number of programs, wrote letters and did things. So that's two. Number three, when we passed the Intelligence Reform Law in 2004 to correct the problem of sharing information, we included a provision setting up a Privacy and Civil Liberties Board. Unfortunately, it wasn't really fully functioning until last year. That's the board that says that the constitutional basis for this phone metadata program, at least according to them, on a 3-2 decision, is questionable. But if that board had been functioning earlier, there would have been that pushback. And finally, I don't think even now what the situation is has been conveyed accurately to the public. Security and liberty are not a zero-sum game. You don't get more of one and less of the other. You get more of both or you get less of both. And I think people understanding better than they do that the collection that's done is, the haystack only, that there is no ability, if you're an if you are a U.S. so-called U.S. person, to probe that haystack unless you go to court and get what amounts to an individualized warrant, which is what the Fourth Amendment requires. I think that would calm people down.
Do you want us to disagree now?
Sure. Why not?
Jane knows how much I love her. But, sometimes there is a trade-off. I agree. Privacy, civil liberties are not a one-for-one trade-off. But there can be trade-offs. I will say now, I think the NSA metadata program was a right thing to do. I wish it could continue in the form it had. But what happened when it was disclosed by Snowden is a lot of people, some of whom knew exactly what was going on and changed their minds when it became public on the Hill, said, wait, we're out of sync. Americans are really uncomfortable with this metadata or not being held. And in that sense, the proxies, the people who are responsible for representing the broader democracy, who are the congressional oversight committees, were out of sync with the general public's view about how they wanted their data held or not held. That's all I'm saying. I actually, again, I agree with where the Congress came out, but I think it's hard to argue that they accurately reflected the broad, however you define it, public sentiment about some of these programs.
Let me move on from the bulk collection because to some degree, it's last year's story. And if you think forward to where a lot of the concern is in the White House now, in the technology community, it's about the nature of cooperation between corporations and the U.S. government. It's about encryption. It's about 0 days. People in the NSA tell me bulk collection's really interesting but really boring. They'd rather give it to the summer interns because it does not require a huge amount of imagination, whereas the other programs that they are working on.
Those are the collectors, not the analysts who are
Those are the
telling you
collectors, yes, the collectors. So, Bob, let me ask you, turn to the business community for a bit. In the reporting I've done, I've had many Silicon Valley companies that read the Snowden disclosures come out and say the following two things to me. First, they don't believe that the NSA was cracking their codes, their encryption very much as they were leaping into the spaces that were still unprotected in the networks. So if there was space between internal servers, for example, within a company, something that was unencrypted, they were just taking advantage of the fact that not full encryption had happened. So the companies have been racing around trying to close up gaps that the disclosures revealed, whether or not the NSA or the Chinese or the Russians or a group of talented teenagers might be exploiting them. They wanted to get the gaps closed. And the second thing they say is they are much less inclined after these disclosures to be at all cooperative with the U.S. government unless they are handed a warrant, because their international business is suffering. If you're an American firm, if you're Cisco, there's an assumption abroad that maybe some backdoor has been put in despite all of the claims of American companies and the government that that's not the way the U.S. operates. So tell us how the relationship has changed to your mind, and what are the dangers in it, and what's healthy in it?
Well, I mean, I think you've got it exactly right. There has been a long, long history of cooperative relationships between American business and American government in the interest of protecting the nation and its citizens. They've not, at least in my experience, companies have not been asked to do anything illegal. They have their own lawyers. They're pretty good at protecting their own interests. But just as you talked about their sort of technological gaps that NSA looks to fill. There are legal gaps. There can be an area of space between what is specifically authorized by statute, what is specifically prohibited by law, and then there's sort of a gray area in between where we've been very successful over the years in securing voluntary cooperation. I think it's an unquestionable loss for our ability to protect the nation if companies will stop that kind of voluntary cooperation. And you know, I've frequently said that the attitudes, public attitudes towards the intelligence community are like a pendulum. They swing between why didn't you stop this to you mean you're doing what? And we're sort of at the you mean you're doing what stage. Sooner or later there will be some intelligence failure in the future. And people will wonder why on earth the intelligence community was not able to protect us, and the pendulum will swing back in the other direction. But for the moment, I personally think that it's a loss to the nation that companies are sort of losing the willingness to cooperate legally and voluntarily with agencies that are trying to protect Americans and citizens of other nations as well. I mean, there's an incredible amount of intelligence that gets shared by us with allies for their purposes.
On the legal side of this, let me just press this a little bit because I think it's hard for people who aren't as familiar with the law here to understand, and people who haven't been practitioners in this to understand. So, you know, if there's a FISA case that involves a U.S. person, whatever, fairly clear what the law is, where you'd have to go to the FISA court or not. Can you give us an example within the bounds of the restrictions, I'm sure, of what you can say publicly, of a case where things were out in this gray area? Give us an example of the gray area where you might in the past have been able to ask for cooperation that today, if you asked, you're not sure what the answer would be.
Well, I can't go into any specifics on this. I can say generically that there is a whole lot of surveillance activity that's not regulated by statute, that's conducted under the authority of Executive Order 12333. The ability to conduct foreign intelligence is an inherent authority of the President under the Constitution. There are statutory restrictions that have been imposed essentially regulating the conduct of surveillance within the United States and directed against United States persons wherever they may be. That leaves lots of unregulated collection that we can do. That collection.
So if you had two foreigners and it was running not through the signals were not running through the United States,
or not being collected within the United States,
or not being collected in the United States, but an American company or maybe even a foreign company might have access to that capability. That's an area where you might go to them and say, "Can you help us out?"
Well, certainly. Let me put it the other way. If we lose that ability, it could have an impact.
Right. But you also have an ability, if you can crack into that system, to do so without getting court approval, because the NSA is a foreign intelligence collection organization.
We don't need court approval for stuff that is done outside of the United States, not directed at United States persons.
Okay, very good. So when you were working at the Counterterrorism Center, did you find that this kind of corporate cooperation played a very essential role? And now as somebody who's sort of on the other side from a company that does a lot of business with the U.S. government, does this look any different to you?
Probably the single most important quiet partnership between the U.S. and another party was not with any individual country. It was with companies in the United States. Those partnerships between the U.S. government and U.S. companies, especially the technology community, some of the crown jewels and some of the secrets that are most carefully protected. So I think those partnerships, not just on counterterrorism, on counterproliferation, on other issues, transnational crime, human smuggling, to basic foreign intelligence issues, absolutely indispensable partnerships between corporate America and the intelligence community. Now, being on the other side, I think you've largely characterized the problem well. I would actually expand it a little bit. And I would say not only was it critical up until 2011 when I was at NCTC, in my view, it is only going to become more important in the coming decades. Very quickly, why? You know, in 1947, when you stand up the intelligence community, you're spying on Russia, you're spying on the Soviet Union. You know, those communications are pretty isolated within private or government networks. Communications today and technology today is everywhere on public networks, public communications, and the like, and that's accelerating. Public encryption, public networks, public communications, that's where the good people are communicating, and it's where some of the bad people are communicating. So this issue of partnership is getting more and more important. From a corporate perspective, undoubtedly the risks to US business opportunities overseas are driving a tremendous amount of the reaction from US companies. When Germany and Deutsche Telekom says we need a Euro-only cloud, when Brazil says we need a Brazil-only cloud for data, I mean, that is very, very much hitting the bottom line. As you said, American companies today go overseas and they say, okay, well, how much of our data is all of it or just 98% of it going to end up with NSA because we know, you know, you're with them. There's another piece, though, I think, David, which is equally problematic. It's not just what some might consider crass capitalist interests which are driving this reaction. It is also very much sort of a global technology privacy community. So I'll tell you, working for a company that's based in Silicon Valley where the average age is 27 and 85% of people are software engineers, they view this through a very, very different lens than the 65-year-old CEOs of these companies, or in some cases, the 29-year-old CEOs of these companies. There is really a sense in that community, which goes beyond any individual company, that NSA and the US government's actions are too intrusive of the privacy that they want to maintain. You know, you look at a company like Snapchat, designed to protect that privacy. There's a reason that they're doing well and people use it. So that relationship of that key technology demographic that the US government needs support from, not just in a democratic way, but because we need those people to work in the government and help the government and bring their expertise into the government, that, I think the Snowden affair has really contributed to a diminishment of that partnership, which in the long run will be very, very harmful to organizations like NSA and CIA.
Can I point out?
I just want to,
Yeah,
if I
go
can,
ahead.
just one thing on this. I think one of the many ironies of where we're going is I think we're going to end up with, number one, we have the real risk of ending up with a very fragmented internet. And number two, you can be pretty sure that if Brazil mandates that there be a Brazil-only cloud, the Brazilian intelligence services are going to have access to that cloud. And so we may end up with something that is a much less effective internet that is in fact much less protective of privacy.
Could you also argue, though, that if there's a Brazilian-only internet or a German-only internet or a Chinese-only internet, it also, because of 12333, makes the intelligence community's life a little bit easier because they could go directly into that, assuming they know what to go look for, without going to get court order, because it's not touching the United States and it's probably not touching American citizens.
Perhaps.
There are two.
I mean, I'm not trying to be coy in there. I just, I think there are a lot of variables that will go into that'll have to be sorted out before you can answer that question.
On that point, balkanizing the internet will prove to be very inconvenient for global customers, and I predict it won't last on that basis, putting aside the privacy issue. But there are two other ironies. One is the business sector knows more about all of us than the government does. Let's understand that. Cookies on your various tools help companies figure out what your shopping habits are, where you physically are, et cetera. And the private sector, at any one moment, without getting without any court review or congressional review or anything else, is much more intrusive. Now you can say, okay, I have the opportunity to opt out. But most people don't fully understand that, and for convenience sake, they don't. That's one irony. Second irony is the kids, who the 29-year-olds or the 12-year-olds, now put all their personal information out on Facebook and LinkedIn and 6 other flavors of things that I don't even know about, and share it with everybody. And these are people who are complaining about the invasions of their privacy. Now, maybe you can say, oh, it's the government doing it instead of just my friends or the private sector. But
There's a Fourth Amendment issue when the government does it that
there
does
is a
not
Fourth
exist.
Amendment issue.
Yeah.
But I would say there are all kinds of restrictions on what the government can do, and they work, and there are no restrictions basically on what the private sector can do.
Okay.
Unless you're in the EU now, in which case you have a court which has made a technologically almost completely infeasible decision about privacy information, right to forget, vis-a-vis what appears in the Google search. So the dysfunction now between policymakers, legal frameworks, and how the technology actually works is also growing and is significantly problematic.
Before we go to the audience, and this is a fascinating conversation, I want to talk a little bit about where this is all going. So if you read the President's, the Advisory Committee report on the NSA that was done by a group of committee members the President appointed, and they reported in December. There are two fascinating, there are many fascinating recommendations. There are two that jumped out at me that go towards sort of the future of what the intelligence community and the NSA in specific can do. One of them said that the United States should not routinely stockpile zero-day flaws, and the White House has since embraced this and turned out a policy concerning it. These are the flaws that would enable, frequently used, to develop cyber weapons, offensive cyber weapons. They can frequently be used to put implants on computers around the world, a key element of doing both cyber exploitation and cyber espionage, and conceivably also cyber attack. There are some in the intel community who have said to me they think this amounts to something of unilateral disarmament, that the Chinese and the Russians and others are not going to be under similar restrictions about whether or not they have to reveal these flaws. And of course there are some exceptions built into the White House rulings. The second is on encryption, where the recommendation was that the NSA should do nothing to weaken commercial encryption. The NSA's argument is they haven't weakened commercial encryption in the past. There are some who dispute that. So, Bob, can you tell us, as you look out at the future, for these two recommendations, one of which the White House has ruled on, one of which I think is probably still in discussion within the intel community, what are the competing values and risks here?
I think an important thing that is lost in a lot of the discussions on this topic is the difference between NSA's technical capabilities and what NSA actually does and is authorized to do. And take encryption as an example. And I'm not, again, I don't comment on any specific activities, but I think that everybody would expect that one of the principal jobs for NSA is to try to figure out how to crack encryption.
Why they were invented in 1952,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And we know that not only terrorists, but a whole bunch of other people, cyber criminals who over the next 10 years may prove to be a lot more of a problem for us than terrorists, foreign intelligence services and so on, they use encryption. And we want to be able to get their communications. And so one hopes that, I think NSA probably has the best technical capabilities in the world in this area. But the important point, and this goes back to the initial point I made, they only use those technical capabilities in furtherance of lawfully authorized activities. And when I say this goes back to the first point, I think that's what we have not done a good job of explaining to the public, of what those authorizations are and how it is that we ensure that NSA uses them only for appropriate purposes. The second point I want to make is that I think the general framework for dealing with these issues has been established by the President in what's Presidential Policy Directive 28, PPD 28, which was issued in January, which basically is a framework for governing the signals intelligence activities going forward. And one of the things that it makes very clear is that in determining whether and how to conduct signals intelligence activities, we need to take into account not only the intelligence benefits from a particular activity, but also the risks of exposure, the risks to commercial interests, the risks to privacy, All of these sorts of things need to be taken into account, and there's a framework set up to ensure that policymakers have these issues presented to them and make conscious decisions on, is this a path we want to go down or not? Is this something where the national security benefits of doing something are so significant that they outweigh whatever risks there may be?
You raised two interesting points. I want to ask Jane and Mike to comment on both of those, but let me just press you on one of them, which is you made a point early on that one of the big lessons of the past year is the government's got to get out and talk more about at least what the capabilities are and what the authorizations are. But in the case of 0 days and the use of offensive cyber weapons, the President of the United States has never publicly talked, at least as I'm aware, of the fact that the United States has a considerable capability and now small arsenal of cyber weaponry. The NSA director has talked about the 6,000 people who are being trained to go out into the armed forces to go deal with this. In the encryption area, I don't recall any lengthy, non-technical conversation that the president, his staff, and others have made about these kinds of trade-offs, except in forums like this. Are these subjects that you think are now going to have to become part of the regular political discourse? Do we want to have cyber weapons? To what degree do we want to give up our ability to crack encryption so that there is a greater confidence in the encryption systems that are out there?
So a couple of comments on that. First of all, you misquoted me slightly but significantly. In fact, I think that discussion of capabilities is probably something that we can't talk about with any degree of specificity. I will note that I do think there has been, even in the absence of official commentary from the government, I think over the last few years, in certain books that have been written, for example, I think there's been a pretty vigorous discussion about whether we should be employing cyber weapons or not. I think that discussion has managed to go on and will continue to go on without our talking about specifically what we do and what we don't do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mike, on these issues or on the question of encryption as we were just discussing?
I tend to think that Bob is largely right. I think there's been a high-level discussion. Should NSA should NSA break encryption? I think we've accepted as a society, yes. Now the circumstances are when and where. We're not going to have a town hall meeting of 280 million people to figure that one out. We could. It'll be slightly unwieldy. So you have a Congress, and Congress says, well, you should be able to break encryption certain circumstances, but let's limit it. That's not going to be completely public. You go back to your intelligence committees, and the intelligence committees have to be the ones who end up being the proxies through the Congress all the way back to those 280 million to figure out the structure to say, you can generally do it this way. We're going to check your homework once a quarter, once a month, however often. We're going to have the FISA court involved to make sure you do these things. As Bob said, I think the presidential directive that requires a broader consideration of pros and cons to these programs is very, very important. So it isn't simply the Intel National Security Group. It is the Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, and others who are involved in that discussion. There's no easy answer. The basic idea of 0 day, just to try to amplify a little bit, is people write software. There are bugs in software, right? Has anyone here ever had Microsoft crash on them? There are bugs, and some of those bugs make those programs vulnerable. And they're called 0 day because no one's discovered it yet. It's 0 day. If you discovered it a day ago, it would be +1. So 0 day means it's an undiscovered bug in the software which can be used to exploit that software. Should the US government sign off and say, we will never use one of these because we will report it? Well, what happens now if that bug would be a very, very useful way to get to see documents, I really am just making this up, to get to see documents on a Syrian government computer about their use of chemical weapons? Would anyone in America think that that might be a good use of a 0 day exploit? Sure. Should we also consider if that 0 day exploit makes us more vulnerable to Chinese hacking in a way which is really problematic in a global economic way? Absolutely. But again, we're not going to have a town hall meeting about that. We have to make sure that those structures that were set up back in the 70s, whether it's the House Intel and Senate Intel committees, whether it's the FISA Intelligence Court, whether it's the President's Civil Liberties Oversight Board, all these organizations are there to do oversight, set the rules, check the homework, and say, that's a pretty good balance. So we don't end up 6 years from now saying, oh, you guys really have misbalanced this, and we need another massive and very hurtful public disclosure of these programs where we lose capability, we could potentially lose people, and we certainly lose billions of dollars of investment that we can't otherwise make.
Well, offensive cyber's here, and whether we like it or not, the Stuxnet virus, whoever disclosed that, did set back Iran's ability to produce centrifuges that worked, however that happened. And there are other uses of offensive cyber, not by the United States if it was involved in Stuxnet, but by Russia, for example, against the 2 breakaway Soviet pieces of Georgia, and in other contexts. So let's not have a debate about whether there ought to be offensive cyber. It's here. I think the debate has to be about the safeguards. And I think that Mike has it right, and I think that Congress needs to be fully informed. Congress is capable, certainly the intelligence committees are capable, even now, of doing a lot more than they're called on to do. That's my view. And it's not just the intelligence committees. I think safeguards through the courts ought to be considered as well. But making sure that the decision is not made just by the technician because we can, but is reviewed by the policymaker because we should, is absolutely critical.
Bob, I asked you at the beginning or in the midst of this, what had happened to cooperation with companies. Tell us a little bit about what's happened with allies. I mean, obviously, in the case of Germany, the disclosure of the monitoring of the Chancellor's cell phone led not only Chancellor Merkel to denounce the U.S., but led this discussion about balkanizing the internet. You didn't hear much about that prior to that disclosure.
Well, you did, but there were people who were advocating for it, but it simply wasn't getting much traction.
And now it's had some traction.
Yeah.
And in fact, she said a few things, Chancellor Merkel said a few things that would suggest that maybe she was either behind it or at least found some political advantage in indicating that she was behind it. And you've seen the same thing happen with Brazilians. You've seen the same thing happen in many countries where the political advantage to them or the trade advantage is to make sure that they are able to block out some American companies. How do you undo that damage today?
So since Jane just passed you a note saying it's time to go to audience
Time to go to the audience, yes.
I'll give a very brief answer to that.
We all know what happens if you don't follow Jane's suggestions.
I'll give a very brief answer to that. I think there are countries have reacted in very different ways. I think the great majority of countries are just letting this pass by. We have very productive intelligence relationships with many countries, and I think many countries understand that we have to do things to get the intelligence we share with them. I think there is a smaller group of countries which is driven by domestic politics, where they have to say things, and we get sort of a nudge and a wink and say, you know we have to say this, but don't really worry about that. I think there are a few countries where they are actually taking this very seriously, usually over the quiet disagreement of their own intelligence services. And I think we're going to have to work that through over the next few years and try to give people a comfort that, in fact, we are not routinely violating the rights of non-U.S. persons either. One of the things that the President directed we do, which I happen to think is a extremely salutary idea, is find ways to codify a degree of protection for personal information of non-U.S. persons. And I think that providing that codification protection is probably the single biggest thing we can do to try to regain trust of other countries.
David, can I just add to that? Because I'm a little freer to speak on this, since this is not stuff I learned while I was in government. Bob is right. Most countries are so reliant on the U.S. because we are the 10 million pound elephant in the world's intelligence communities. They need us. We provide so much to all of them. They're not going to break these relationships. That being said, there's a whole lot of exasperation. Post WikiLeaks, you have that problem. Then you have Snowden just going, really, guys? is this really the best you could do, U.S.? And there's this almost questioning of basic competence and ability to protect secrets, which isn't going to fracture the relationship again because it's so necessary for their national security, but it really, I think, has undermined our credibility in important ways with our allies.
Okay, so we've got 20 minutes, and so I just asked, there'll be microphones coming around you. If you would tell us who you are and make sure that your question's really a question. And we'll start with the gentleman right in front here.
Thank you. My name is Chris Segoyan. I'm the principal technologist for the ACLU. So Flame, the sort of cousin of Stuxnet, was in many ways far more impressive to the technical community because of some cryptographic stuff that it contained. But one of the key features of Flame was that whoever was behind it, I see you guys do that all the time, whoever was behind Flame masqueraded as the Microsoft Windows Update Service. Microsoft Windows comes with a feature that pushes security updates out to every Windows computer, and whoever did Flame, the way it worked is that it pretended to be Windows. It took advantage of cryptographic vulnerability to impersonate Microsoft. Similarly, we learned not so far back that NSA apparently impersonated Facebook servers in order to deliver malware to a particular user. Now, I'm not going to ask anyone on the panel to confirm or deny those particular cases. The Facebook incident actually led to Mark Zuckerberg calling up the president. But what I would like to know from probably Bob first, and anyone else who'd like to comment, what rules currently exist to either permit or prohibit the impersonation of US companies to their users in the United States or to users around the world? Clearly, US companies are not that happy about that kind of impersonation.
I actually am not sure I feel comfortable answering that, just because, not for security reasons, but just because I'm not sure I'd get the law and the rules exactly right in this area, and I don't want to authorize it. I will say that generally speaking, anything that, as I said earlier, anything that has to be done for an authorized foreign intelligence purpose and within the law. There are rules on what we can do with U.S. person information and so on. I'm just not comfortable talking. I don't feel that I am sufficiently conversant with that to give you an off-the-cuff answer on that.
So I'll offer an unclassified analogy, two very quick analogies. The doctor in Pakistan involved in collecting information before the Osama bin Laden successful raid came and tried to get information saying he was involved in a polio, correct? Polio?
Well, and he was doing real polio vaccines along the way.
Vaccination, right?
That's right.
So the president and John Brennan came out now and said, we're not going to do this sort of thing. We're not going to masquerade in these terms. Long ago, the U.S. intelligence community made public statements that they weren't going to use cover as a journalist because it put the journalism community at risk in a way that was counterproductive. That's the human intelligence world. We have to end up with the same set of rules and standards for the technology community. Right. It doesn't answer whether or not they should do it, Microsoft this or Google that. They're legitimate questions. But assume that there is some value to that. It's got to be it's got to be a quiet conversation with those companies saying, hey, we might be doing this. Would that be a problem? Or if we did this in this limited way. So again, doesn't answer the question, but I don't think we can easily say either way, you should or shouldn't ever do it.
Yeah, I think one thing you might say is that there might be a difference between a targeted masquerade and a generalized masquerade. In other words, it's one thing for the NSA to put up a website accessible to everybody that pretends we're Microsoft, and another thing to take a validated foreign intelligence target and send that target something that says we're Microsoft. Those are things you might view very differently in the abstract.
Chris, if I understood your question right, in the Facebook case, no matter who did it, it wasn't targeted. Flame was out there sort of generally.
You're conflating the two.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go explain whether or not you believe this was targeted or not.
So we don't know exactly how Flame spread. Maybe Kim has a better idea. She's writing a book about this. But do you want to say?
Yeah, so it's an important distinction to make between when it could be sort of widespread and when it was targeted. Flame spread by first infecting a computer on a local network. So they could target a company, infect one computer on that network, and then that computer, any other computer on the network that tried to reach out to Microsoft servers to update itself would get diverted to a server that the attackers controlled. And then the Flame malware would be spread to that computer. So it wasn't subverting the Microsoft servers in a way that it would attack everyone, but it still undermines the credibility of the Microsoft company through that impersonation.
So I realize nobody here can comment on the individual case, but as a broader question, Bob, is the intelligence community now considering rules that would govern the impersonation of corporate American software in the way that it would be analogous to the rules that have since been announced after the Pakistan polio case?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to comment specifically about some of the things we're considering, and I will, just point generically back to the provision in PPT 28 that says we have to take into account the effect on businesses in determining what kind of activities to conduct. But as to whether we're considering specific rules or not, I wouldn't want to comment.
Which means you do have to, after the PPD is out, though, it would be reasonable for us to assume there's some process that's set up to actually turn that into reality.
Right. I think the PPD talks about the kind of process that'll be followed.
Okay.
And I'll just repeat what I said before. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Something Obama has said personally. And I think I don't work there. I work here in this nice nonpartisan space. But certainly there has to be a process, and this has to be very thoughtfully considered. And broad brush policies, I would agree with Mike, are not the way to go. Targeted strategies that have a specific goal in mind are obviously much more effective.
And clearly you have to think in the technical space, it can be more difficult to be targeted. You have to know how things are going to be controlled so they don't get out to a broader community in a way that in the human intelligence world, you don't really have that problem.
Right. Sir.
Thank you. Great panel. I'm Adam Eisger. I'm the Managing Director for Government Relations of the American Library Association's office here in town. We, in turn, are part of a much, much larger coalition, essentially a who's who of civil and cyber-civil libertarian organizations that have been very active in privacy and surveillance legislation and policy issues. Quickly, two very quick points, and it is a question. I don't think it's unfair to paraphrase all of the panelists in suggesting that further transparency in the process to the maximum extent possible is necessary to restore public and congressional trust. So part one of what I wanted to ask about is it then fair or unfair of me to extrapolate that you would suggest that Congress push back against the administration in its most recent efforts in the USA Freedom Act debate, which is currently ongoing in Congress, particularly in the Senate, push back against the notion that we do not need a special advocate to be sort of read into and a participant in the legal process of issuing warrants. That particular provision was in the agreement that was reached between the House and the Senate, House Judiciary and Intel committees, but it was stripped out in the version of the USA Freedom Act that went to the floor, reportedly, I wasn't there, on the request of the administration. Similarly, there's a debate we haven't talked about, time is tight, on ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which as I've come as certainly not an expert, but an interested layperson to understand it, does not require a warrant of any kind to access all kinds of information, including emails, texts, photos that are older than 6 months old, and a much, much broader range of electronic communications. It would seem if trust is imperative to restore, then we ought to be looking hard at legislation that is moving now at ECPA reform as well to interpose a warrant requirement.
Well,
Any and all comments welcome.
Sure, there certainly is a movement among many companies. We ran a story on this the other day to try to go revise that second law you just described. Bob, is this?
So I believe that the administration has said they support revisions to ECPA. The 180-day And I should say that ECPA doesn't, I believe, does not apply to intelligence activities at all. But I think it's hard to justify a difference between an email that's 179 days old and an email that's 181 days old. And so I do think that that's one of a number of statutes that could stand to be updated. It's very difficult to write statutes governing technological activity and then expect them to continue to be valid 20 years later. On the first point, it's not entirely correct to say that the provision for special advocate was stripped out, because what is in there now is a provision for the court to appoint amicus curiae from a panel of cleared lawyers. I think that there were considerable, you have to bear in mind that the FISA court already has its own staff of lawyers. Whose job it is to essentially, to review everything that the government submits and push back on it. And so, number one, there's a question of is the special advocate going to be, to some extent, replicating that? There was also, and I think you had the FISA court express the view that a permanent office of special advocate was not something that they favored because you have the problem of once you have a person whose job it is to do this, what are they going to be looking for? The idea here, I think, that everybody has bought into is, and I will say personally, not that I think it's necessary, because the FISA court has not been sufficiently protective of privacy and legal interest, but because of a need to ensure some sort of public confidence in what the FISA court does, that there needs to be some opportunity in appropriate cases for an independent voice to be heard by the court. And that's exactly what the current version of the Act does provide. It simply provides it by a slightly different mechanism.
Let me just add to this. First of all, I support a robust public debate about all of this, and we're finally having it. Second of all, I support the Freedom Act. Everyone here understands that legislation is compromise if you're ever going to pass anything, and hopefully this will pass. It has passed the House, and there was a compromise between two committees that had very different views of this, the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committee. And then there has to be a negotiation with the White House. So where this ends up, I think, is not absolutely clear. I do think there should be much more transparency than there is, and I think that the decisions of the FISA court, many of them, can easily be substantially declassified. You can redact any of the specific names and so forth, but the basis on which the FISA court formed its opinions, I think, should be available to the public, and I think the public would be substantially reassured. The FISA court is a rotating court of federal judges. It's not some special group that talks to itself endlessly for hundreds of years. And finally, the other point to make is the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board is now out there. And remember, this is the board that thinks that the metadata program on a 3-2 vote is not constitutionally valid. So this is a court that's going to be a process.
A group that thinks it's a court.
That thinks it's a court. That's going to be engaged in continuing to vet these issues. So I don't think it's an echo chamber anymore, and that's a good thing. And I do think that the Freedom Act, however it ends up, is going to go a long way to giving the public more comfort with this program.
We've just got 7 or 8 minutes left, so let's go to the back row here. We're going to take 2 questions, and then we'll do the answers. So here, and then right behind you to the...
My name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. You spend most of my time overseas. But Mr. Litt, I think I understood you to say earlier that the president or somebody can okay spying on any foreign government as long as they're all foreigners. But then I heard you toward the end of your discussion saying that it didn't seem to be okay to spy on Mrs. Merkel. So I wonder if you could explain this seeming paradox. Is it a question of being okay to spy on bad guys but not on good guys? Perhaps you could clarify that a little.
And if you just hand the mic there, we're just going to do 2 questions at a time, Bob, and then I'll let you get to that. Right back here, yeah. This gentleman.
Hi, I'm Joe Marks. I'm a reporter with Politico. You spoke earlier about the lowering of trust between the rest of Congress and the intelligence committees and the broader public. There were a couple of amendments to the House version of the Intel Authorization Act that didn't make much of anywhere and weren't included in the final bill that made it to the floor, that would have expanded the clearance for the members of Congress to a couple of other committees, sometimes to the whole Congress, that could review some of these programs. Do you think some kind of expansion like that has a future in independent legislation anytime, and would there be value in it?
So on the first question, when you answer it, Bob, the president has now not only said that the United States would not monitor Chancellor Merkel's phone, but has also said there's a process set up for foreign leaders. Maybe you could just cover a little of that in your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I said anything about Chancellor Merkel in my comments. I certainly didn't say what you said I said. I think what I said was that I believe that as a constitutional and legal matter, the president and the executive branch have the ability to determine what kind of foreign intelligence surveillance not involving either activities within the United States or U.S. persons is to be conducted, that's not limited by statute. How that is carried out is a policy matter. And the president's made a determination that he did not want to be collecting Angela Merkel's cell phone calls. All of the foreign intelligence collection that we do is done pursuant to actually a fairly regimented process, which starts with policymakers making a determination of what kind of foreign intelligence do we need to conduct, and it's actually prioritized into several tiers, and that gets sent out to the intelligence community to execute on that. To go to David's point, we now have layered over that a process that's been set up pursuant to PPD 28. Unfortunately, I can't talk about it in great detail because the actual details are in a classified annex, but it essentially involves, as Mike said, bringing in a wider range of government agencies to offer views on how particular surveillance ought to be conducted.
And when you offer those views,
Yep.
When there are covert programs that are done at the CIA, there's usually an annual review that, if I understand it right, says if this operation is exposed, is the damage done by the exposure greater than the intel that we are, and that was not done at the NSA prior to this. Is it fair to say that now that a roughly analogous system is going to be in place at the NSA where they have to judge whether exposure would be more harmful than the quality of the intel that you're getting?
Well, without drawing any analogies to anything else, I do think it is, that it is true that going forward, that one of the considerations in conducting conducting signals intelligence activities will be what's the risk of exposure, and given the risks of exposure, do we want to conduct this activity or not?
And then on the legislation, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I was going to deal with the oversight thing, by saying that how Congress structures its oversight is really an internal matter for Congress.
Well, but on that point, I don't know how Mike feels. It takes a while to learn how to hear intelligence information, and I do think there is a value to having intelligence committees that are fully immersed in this, and I don't think that every member of Congress has the time or interest to be fully immersed. So that would be the first point. Second point is Congress as a whole is briefed from time to time on sensitive intelligence information. I think I read today that the administration's coming up to brief all 100 senators on the Bergdahl swap. And there's some sensitive intelligence information that will be part of that. Every member of Congress does sign an oath about not violating the rules for receiving classified information, and the members of the Intelligence Committee sign a double oath about being extremely careful, and I think most members are very careful. So it is Congress's decision. My view is I'm not sure it would really enhance oversight capability to take all members of Congress to another level on intelligence information.
We do have a basic problem in Congress. If you remember the Iraq WMD NIE back in 2004, I believe the total number of senators who read that before their vote on war was 16. I may have it off by a little bit, but roughly 80 plus didn't read it. So it's not just you can expand the access, you actually also have to expand the involvement in these tough decisions. In the case of the metadata program and some other sensitive programs, the information was there for review with briefings beyond simply the intelligence community.
Right.
It was not limited to the intelligence community. Now, to the extent that expanding the access to intelligence, adding a little bit more oversight, would increase public trust that their representatives were actually doing what they want them to do, I think it's probably worth the trade-off, although substantively, I doubt is going to significantly affect the degree and quality of oversight.
And how much is there a risk? And you had to go up to brief Congress every
It was great.
20 or 30 minutes.
My favorite part of my job.
Yeah.
That hurts my feelings.
Did you ever find that that created much operational risk? And did Congress, into your mind, leak? I mean, the Bergdahl case, which Jane just mentioned, is an interesting example because the argument that the administration has offered about why they didn't do 30 days or even 15 days or even 10 minutes of advance notification was concern of operational risk.
I tend to think that the executive branch actually exaggerates the risk of leaks coming from Congress. I think most members and most staff are very, very careful about these things. And if you look at the history of major leaks we've had over the past 10 or 15 years, you've had some screw-ups by Congress, but you've had more screw-ups and leaks coming from the executive branch than you had from Congress. So I found them pretty protective of these things. Whenever you're dealing with U.S. persons and domestic investigations, it is that much harder, not related to Congress, but related to the standards and tradition of the Department of Justice. So some of this is hard. I think Congress can probably be trusted. Jane is absolutely right. It does take a level of comfort and experience to know what is sensitive and what is not. So you do run a greater risk, I think, of accidental disclosure of sensitive information from Congress. You just run a bigger chance of purposeful disclosure from the executive branch.
But there's one more thing to add, and I know time's up, but Congress can also add a little value. I know that may seem counterintuitive to many of you, but I ran into Mike Rogers a couple nights ago, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who was, quite upset that there had been no brief of the Bergdahl swap. But Congress was briefed, he said, on a bipartisan basis in 2011, and the same cast of characters is presently in the leadership on both sides. Dutch Ruppersberger is the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, and they had a long, intelligent discussion about this. Advice was given, advice was taken, and I think he feels, and I actually would strongly agree with this, that that process should have been followed again, and whether the decision came out the same way or not, that exchange would have been valuable to both sides.
Yeah, I actually agree with Jane's point about the value that Congress can add, but I do think that right now we are in a period where there is such a degree of distrust between Congress and the executive branch on both sides that it is very hard to engage, for both sides to be willing to engage in a constructive fashion. And I hope that over the next few years we can move away from that and move back to a more constructive engagement, because I think there is real benefit to constructive interchange with the intelligence committees.
Well, we are not out of subject matter here, but we are out of time. So I want to thank all three of you for what I think was a really great start to this. We covered a lot of new ground in something that, topic matter that has been exhaustively discussed in Washington, and still I think all three of you found new things to say about it, for which I deeply appreciate, and thank all of you for your very good questions, and we look forward to the rest of the day.
I just wanted to say we're going to take a quick break and start as soon as we can to get back on schedule in about 5 minutes. So thanks, everyone.